Good afternoon, everybody. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me. Is Sharia law consonant with the U.S. Constitution? This is an issue that was raised by then presidential candidate and now Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, back in 2016 during the primaries. And he basically stated that he did not believe that a Muslim should be elected president of the United States because Sharia law contradicts the Constitution. He later clarified that to say that he'd have no problem with a Muslim being elected if they were willing to reject or disavow Sharia law. So the question is he right? Is a Sharia law consistent with the Constitution? And now, at the time, he was vilified by many of the liberal elites who said that he had said something bigoted, putting aside the fact that he happens to be black, but this idea that he had something against Muslims. But really, it is they who have something against Muslims, I would argue, for their refusal to examine and criticize Sharia law. After all, it is Sharia law and Sharia compliant nations that oppress Muslims, and particularly women. It's actually a horror show for women in these nations. Honor killings, child brides, forced marriages, divorce at the drop of a hat, polygamy, slavery, circumcision, female circumcision. Women are treated very, very poorly in these countries. Women have no rights. I think that in Islam, women are literally seen as unequal to men, unlike here in the West, where all men and women are created equal. And so those who refuse to discuss and examine Sharia law dispassionately, which is one of the most oppressive systems in the world today, they're the ones who are anti-Muslim, because they're the ones who are condemning hundreds of millions, tens of millions of women in particular, but people in general, to these authoritarian systems. And, they say, well, criticizing Sharia law is like criticizing Jewish law. Actually, I want to talk about that briefly, but first of all, no. It's more like the ban on criticizing Sharia law is done by the same people who refuse to criticize communism and Stalinism and Maoism, which were responsible for the murders of hundreds of millions of human beings, because they just, so in a sense, they were more complicit in that than anyone. Now, how is Sharia law comparable to Jewish law or halacha? Not at all. Jewish law does not call for any of those things around women. Jewish law does not allow, such extreme oppression. And I would also point out that one of the most fundamental differences in a sense that's important to Americans, is that Jewish law does not claim to impose itself upon the entire world. Islamic Sharia law does. Islamic Sharia law includes jihad, which is unique to it. This idea that you have to engage in military conquest or subterfuge in order to create a one world government, so that imitates and mimics the one God in heaven, their perception of God, which they call Allah. And that to get there, all means are justified. In that sense, by the way, the Sharia-compliant believers are similar to communism as well, which believes in ongoing revolution as a way to create a one-world ant colony where everyone's de facto equal. Jewish law, on the other hand, halacha, only applies to Jews, and it's not forced. It's voluntary. If a woman doesn't want to live under halacha in an ultra-Orthodox community, for example, she is free to leave, as are her family members. They can move to Tel Aviv, where there is very little effects of Jewish law. In other words, maybe I'm using a bad example here, and I say that with due respect to the Orthodox who I look to. But the point I'm making is that it's voluntary. You don't have to do it. You can leave Judaism. You can leave that particular Jewish community. You might have to deal with the pangs of ostracism, granted. But there's, unlike Sharia law, which calls for the execution of apostates, apostasy or just simply a falling away is permissible in Judaism. It's not it's frowned upon, but there's no law that says you have to observe halakha. So that very basic difference is key. And also in halakha, even though in an observant sense of how to carry out ritual and certain aspects of Jewish life, women are not equal to men. That's true. In the bigger sense, in the secular sense, women are equal to men in the terms of living in this world and professionally and viewed as equal in terms of intellectually. Women are de facto viewed as equal to men because the Torah says that God created man and women in his image, and it does specifically say women. So that's the Torah view, the halacha view. I also just want to conclude here by pointing out that there's been a good deal of tumult on the in the YouTube sphere about Jews secretly trying to implement the 7 Noahide laws on the world. People like Adam Green and some of these young guys who are very anti-Israel, and they make reference to Zionism, that they believe this, and they particularly point to Chabad as the culprit. And what I would suggest here, if you look at the Noahide covenant, and I had the opportunity to talk about this with Shlomo Gordon, who's a candidate for the Knesset in Israel. The very first of the 7 Noahide covenants is that all of mankind is commanded to set up separate nations. So where is their world conquest? Where is their domination? It actually calls for the establishment of separate nations, and that's what Judaism is all about. Judaism is not trying to rule the world, unlike Islam and unlike communism. It seeks to take possession of that little tiny swath of land between the Jordan River and the Great Sea, which God commanded Moses, God commanded Abraham, and Joshua, and etc., right down the line, to take possession of, but nothing more and nothing less. And that little tiny land is exactly where Israel is today. So, it's a very modest and proper ambition. The Noahide covenant is simply a covenant for all of mankind to basically maintain moral standards. I mean, besides the covenant, the law to set up separate nations, there are things like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt have a separate judiciary, which is the beginning of separate government, limited government, and thou shalt not worship graven images. Again, these are guidelines for the world that are not to be enforced. They are to be suggested. There's no claim that Jewish armies need to conquer nations to force them to observe the Noahide covenant. We hope they do, and we do so. We preach to them to do this in the same way that Christianity preaches belief in Jesus as Messiah, as a way to have salvation, not by force, but by a personal relationship, by willingness. So those are the differences between Sharia and Judaism and Christianity, for that matter, and that in a sense we now no longer can discuss Sharia, and by doing so we're condemning entire groups of people to horrors of oppression. And finally, Sharia is not compatible to the U.S. Constitution, which does not allow for such practices as honor killings and child brides and female genital mutilation, etc. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, everyone. Charles Moscowitz, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.